The story begins with the Valdez family, Anna, her husband Manuel, and their two children, Lucas 12 and Mia 8, moving into a quiet, rural village. They're hoping for a peaceful life away from the city, renting an old, affordable house near the forest. On their first night, a local woman, Dolores, knocks on their door warning them to leave before it's too late. She tells Anna they come for families. They came for mine, brushing it off as a strange superstition. Anna and Manuel thank her and say goodnight. In the following days, Anna begins noticing strange things. Lucas tells her he saw a figure standing outside his window at night, just beyond the tree line. Mia refuses to sleep alone, saying she hears whispers coming from the forest. Manuel tries to rationalize the events, thinking the move is causing the children stress. But when the power inexplicably goes out one night, they feel watched and uneasy. Shadows move along the walls, and they hear faint footsteps outside. The next day, Anna meets Dolores again in the village. Dolores warns her more urgently, saying, "If you stay, you'll vanish like the others." She reveals that 3 other families who had moved to the village disappeared without a trace, and the villagers believe the forest takes them. One stormy night, Anna and Manuel wake up to the sound of Lucas and Mia screaming. They rush to the children's room, but they are gone. The window is wide open, and footprints trail off into the forest. Panicked, they run outside and follow the footprints, calling out for their children. But the deeper they go, the quieter it becomes. The trail leads them to the lake, where they see 2 small figures standing at the water's edge. But as they draw closer, the figures disappear. At that moment, they hear a distorted whisper, saying, "You've come, stay with us." Fear overwhelms them as they realize they're completely alone in the dark woods. They turn back, but the path seems different. It feels like the forest has closed in around them. Lost and exhausted, Anna and Manuel stumble upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Inside, they find children's drawings scrawled on the walls, showing families with empty eyes. Among the drawings are photos of other families who vanished, families who look terrified and grainy, faded photos. As they search the cabin, they find a notebook detailing the last days of the previous family who went missing. It ends with the line, "Once you've heard the forest call, you can never leave." Suddenly, they hear Lucas and Mia's voices echoing from the forest. They rush outside, calling for their children. In the fog, they see Lucas and Mia standing by the lake, facing away. Anna approaches, calling to them, but as she touches Lucas, he turns with empty, black eyes, whispering, "Join us." In horror, Anna and Manuel realize that they've lost their children to whatever dark force resides in the forest. They feel a pull, as if something is drawing them into the lake, and suddenly they feel freezing hands pulling them down. The scene fades as Anna's scream echoes through the woods and silence falls. Weeks later, villagers search the woods for the Valdez family, who, like others before them, have vanished without a trace. Dolores looks out into the trees, knowing they will never return, like the others who ignored the warnings. Please subscribe if you want contents like this. Thank you. Emma was home alone for the weekend, something she usually enjoyed. She had the house to herself, free to read, cook, or watch horror movies until late. But that night, as she was rinsing her dinner plate, she felt the hair on her neck prick up. It was a cold feeling, sudden and unmistakable. She shrugged it off, blaming the horror movie she'd watched earlier. Then she heard a soft creak from upstairs. Her heart pounded. It's probably nothing, she told herself, trying to believe it. She finished up in the kitchen, but the nagging feeling lingered. Her eyes drifted to the staircase, where shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the dark. Deciding she was being silly, she grabbed her phone and sat down on the couch, turning on the TV to drown out her nerves. That's when she noticed her phone screen light up a message. Her stomach twisted as she read the text. "Why are you in the living room?" She froze, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to call the police, but her hands were trembling too much to press the buttons. She forced herself to stand, eyes darting toward the front door. She'd just taken a step when another message buzzed through. "Going somewhere?" Choking back a scream, she looked around, trying to remember where she'd left her keys. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked, this time behind her, closer than before. Emma slowly turned, only to see her bedroom door at the end of the hall swing open, casting a long shadow across the floor. In the doorway stood a figure, half hidden in darkness, a twisted grin visible even in the dim light. The final message came through. "I see you." In the last instant before she moved, she saw his face, a familiar face, one she knew well. And before the darkness swallowed her whole, she realized it was her own. It was late afternoon when Emily decided to go for a hike. The sun hovered low over the dense trees, casting an orange glow across the narrow dirt trail. She had hiked these woods countless times before, but today there was something different. The birds were quiet. The air, usually filled with the buzzing of insects and soft rustling of leaves, was strangely still. Ignoring the prickle of unease, Emily pushed forward, breathing in the earthy scent of the forest. As she walked, the silence grew oppressive. Each step she took echoed back to her, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She was about halfway up the trail when she noticed something strange lying on the ground, a shiny silver whistle. It looked new, completely out of place in the wilderness. She picked it up, examining the odd scratches on its surface. 3 short scratches on one side, 4 long on the other, almost like tally marks. Frowning, she slid the whistle into her pocket and continued on. The trail wound up a steep incline, and as Emily climbed, she felt eyes on her. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing nothing but twisted tree trunks and deep shadows. Just as she turned to continue, she heard a snap, a twig breaking somewhere behind her. Her heart hammered. She stopped, listening, straining to catch any sound, but everything was silent once more. Shaking off the feeling, she quickened her pace. But as she rounded a bend, she found herself face to face with something horrifying. Draped over a bush at the side of the trail was a muddy, torn piece of fabric, a pale blue, like her own jacket. She touched it hesitantly, and a sinking feeling twisted in her stomach. It was damp, and as she drew her hand back, she realized it was stained with something dark. Just then, the silence was shattered by a distant, low whistle. It was the same eerie 3-note melody, repeating itself over and over. The sound sent a chill down her spine. She knew there was no one else on this trail. She'd checked the parking lot when she arrived, and hers was the only car. As she walked faster, almost jogging now, the whistle grew louder, closer. She glanced back and saw something flash between the trees, a shadow, too big to be an animal. She forced herself to keep moving, but her pace quickened. The whistling followed her, matching her stride, echoing through the trees like a taunt. She reached into her pocket, gripping the whistle she'd found earlier, hoping that somehow it might help. But as she touched it, she felt a strange vibration against her palm, as if the whistle itself was alive. She nearly dropped it, but something made her hold on tighter. The path suddenly split. One way led back down to the parking lot, and the other wound deeper into the forest, up toward the ridge. She hesitated, feeling that dread rise urging her to go back. But as she looked down the trail, she spotted a figure standing in the distance. A man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by shadows. He was too far away for her to make out any details, but his stance was unmistakable. He was waiting. Without thinking, she turned and sprinted up the ridge trail, her legs burning as she pushed herself forward. The whistling continued, louder now, like it was coming from all directions. It played tricks on her mind, seeming to get closer then farther away, but always there. She glanced back only once, and her blood went cold. The man was following her, moving through the trees with an unnatural speed and silence. Her lungs burned as she reached the top of the ridge. The forest opened up, and she could see the valley stretching out before her, dark and endless. She turned, realizing she was trapped. The only way back was the trail she'd come up, and the shadowy figure was getting closer. In a surge of desperation, she raised the whistle to her lips and blew as hard as she could. Nothing happened. The whistle made no sound, as if the air itself refused to acknowledge her. She tried again and again, but each time it was met with silence. But then she heard a soft rustling behind her. She turned, hoping for help, but froze. Standing in the shadows of the trees were figures, pale, ghostly, almost translucent, their faces blank, eyes hollow and staring. She recognized one of them instantly. It was her friend, Sarah, who had disappeared on a hike 2 years ago in these very woods. One by one, the figures stepped forward, whispering her name in unison. Emily! A scream clawed its way up her throat as she backed away, only to find the man now blocking her path. His face was still obscured, but he tilted his head as if studying her, and she felt his gaze pierce right through her. Desperate, she blew the whistle once more, and this time it let out a faint, eerie tone. The sound echoed through the woods, and as it faded, the ghostly figures surrounded her, reaching out with cold, ethereal hands. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the man's face as he smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that promised she would join the other spirits in the woods. Days later, a search party found her backpack on the trail, but no sign of Emily was ever discovered. Just a lone whistle, scratched with strange marks, lying on the forest floor. To this day, hikers report hearing faint whistling in those woods, especially as the sun begins to set. And those brave enough to follow it always find the same thing, a whistle lying on the ground, waiting for the next soul to claim. During the Hungry Ghost Month in Taiwan, the air is thick with tales of restless spirit seeking sustenance. This story, said to be based on true events, happened to a local tour guide named Chen. Chen was familiar with the customs and warnings surrounding Hungry Ghost Month. Growing up, he'd heard the rules. No whistling, no swimming at night, and avoid wandering alone after dark. as hungry ghosts were believed to roam, eager for food and sometimes revenge. One evening, Chan had a late group tour near the old Jufan village, famous for its winding streets and misty mountain views. After the tour ended, he waited for his bus, but it was running late. The streets emptied, and his phone battery was dead. As he waited, he sensed a chill creep down his spine, as though unseen eyes were watching him. Uneasy, Chen decided to take an old stone path leading to the main road, hoping to catch a taxi. Despite his nerves, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Halfway down the narrow path, Chen heard a soft humming, a faint melody coming from somewhere ahead. He stopped, looking around but seeing no one. The song grew louder and sadder, and Chen felt a tug as if the melody itself was urging him forward. Then he saw her. A woman in a white dress stood by a small shrine to the side of the path, her back facing him. Her long, dark hair hung past her waist and moving in the night breeze. Remembering the tales of spirits that walked during Hungry Ghost Month, Chen's heart raced. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice wavering. "Are you lost?" The woman didn't respond, standing eerily still. Chen took a tentative step forward, but felt a deep, unnatural dread hold him back. His grandmother had given him a packet of rice earlier that day, a protection charm. He reached for it instinctively. The woman turned. Her face was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, with hollow, wide eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Slowly, a too wide smile spread across her face, her mouth stretching inhumanly far as she stared at him with a ravenous intensity. Chen's hands shook as he remembered his grandmother's advice. If confronted by a spirit, make an offering, and never turn your back on it. With a shaky breath, Chen ripped open the packet of rice, placing it on the ground as he whispered, "Please accept this offering." The woman's face was now inches from his own, her eyes devouring him as her mouth opened wider, emitting a hollow, chilling laugh that echoed down the empty path. Chen felt her cold breath, his heart pounding as he backed away slowly, keeping his eyes locked on her and muttering a desperate prayer. Finally, he reached the main road and dared to glance back. The woman was gone, the path empty and silent. Chen returned home and told his grandmother what had happened. She went pale, lighting incense and praying for his safety. Over the next few nights, Chen heard faint humming outside his window and felt cold spots in his apartment. Though he never took that path again, the memory lingers. Some believe that the woman Chen encountered was the spirit of someone who perished on that very path, trapped by unfinished business and destined to wander each Hungry Ghost Month, hungry for offerings and for those who would remember her.